Hey everyone, this is Eric Blackburn. I'm the BIM manager at Berardi Partners here in Columbus, Ohio. It's my extreme honor to introduce our guest for today's presentation. His name is Aaron Mahler. He's the president and founder of Parallax Team out of Dallas, Texas. He's also known on forums worldwide with a very long history as Twice Roads Fool. Hopefully there's a good story behind that name you maybe want to share with us or not. He's also been described as the mayor of BIM Street at Autodesk University, although others would describe it more as the president of the Homeowners Association. So he's bringing us a very touchy subject, links, groups, and multifamily modeling, picking which sucky things you want to deal with. Lots of opinions, one side or the other, and Aaron is about to make some sense out of all of it. And with that, I will turn it over to him and look forward to a great presentation. Thank you, Aaron, for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, so just a couple quick notes, and I forget because I know some people are in through Eventbrite, so I don't know if everybody's in the Zoom or in Eventbrite. I've got the Zoom chat open on the other screen, so if there's anything you want to ask, you can pop a message in the chat, or you can unmute and talk. You know, we just might get slightly off track. So there's a few PowerPoint slides. I do have a bunch of models actually opened. Obviously, it'll be more fun to jump into models and look at stuff in Revit. And for part of the presentation, we'll jump in the Wayback Machine and go back to Revit 2014, just so we can talk about some history. But I'm going to jump in just to the PowerPoint stuff. We'll knock that out, and then we'll get into the more fun stuff. So as Eric mentioned, I'm the director of Parallax Team. We're 5 people. If you're on social media, you may know most of us. All 5 of us either come from architecture, landscape architecture, construction technology, or software programming, and we work with a bunch of different clients to actually just help them deliver projects. One thing I love about our team is that we all still do actually work on projects. We get into models with our clients all the time. We like to stay pretty rooted in practice. So kicking this off, a lot of folks ask us, we have a lot of clients that do multifamily work. Whether it's, tower and block style, where it's one large building and there's a bunch of different unit types that are within it, or whether it's something like garden style. And the reason I want to talk about building typology first is, unfortunately, for whatever reason, when people ask us the whole links versus groups question, they think it's a one-size-fits-all answer. And it is, but there are some asterisks that we have to put on top of it. So as an example, in a tower and block style building, there's really only one sub-element, and that's at the apartment level, right? So you've got a bunch of different apartment types, but there's really only one sub-element. That's a little different when you're doing garden style or multiple building scenarios, because now, you've got the project as the whole, and then the first sub-element is, of course, the different building types, but then there's a sub-element of the building type, which is the apartments and the units. And while that's a nuanced difference, we do need to talk about it, because I would never tell any client that, either links or groups work in both of these situations for every level of the subdivisions. So I am just going to, I am not going to mute because I'm not the host. So if anybody jumps in and you forget to mute yourself, you can just hit the mute button. That'd be awesome. Okay, so one of the first things that we're going to talk about is one of the first questions I ask project teams when they ask me how to set up their model is, what's the drawing set organization, or how does the project need to go together? Because the top one is the simplest setup, right? So it's a block style building. There's one set of drawings. Everything is getting issued in that one set of drawings. So that's pretty basic.
Where they're at?
The breakout meeting. He's asking what is that about?
Hey, Joseph, can we get you to mute your microphone? Thank you. Okay, so the second setup is that there is one big drawing set. Everything is going in the one drawing set, but it is garden style buildings. And that is a bit different than this bottom option, which is that, it's garden style, but each building is going in for a different permit, and they are completely different sets of drawings. Our answer to how to set that up in terms of links versus groups is going to change in those two situations. So that's why we want to acknowledge first that there are different drawing set organizations. And one that's not really common in multifamily, I don't find, but it was very common in the retail world, is even when you have garden style multiple buildings, then the question does come up, are the drawings oriented to each building, or is the entire project just subdivided regardless of building orientation? We used to do this a lot for shopping malls because according to the code, even though malls had freestanding buildings, they were often evaluated as one large building because things like fire trucks couldn't get down the concourses and such. So anyways, we'll come back to that in a bit. I just wanted to kind of cover that, you know, in these situations, there are, again, different levels of sub-elements. So the tower and block building is the only one where there's just one hierarchy level. Okay, so let's cover basically the two easiest cases, and that is the apartments themselves, the bottommost level of hierarchy. And that's the one where, surprise, surprise, if you haven't already heard me talk about this, or if you didn't know what we were going to cover today, when you get to the actual apartments themselves, model groups are going to be a lot more sustainable than linked files. But we're going to show you files that are using both, and then we'll talk about why that's the case. Then when we get into the edge cases that we talked about a few minutes ago, we'll look at where you end up with a hybrid approach where there will always be, mind you, model groups for apartments. You'll never see anybody at Parallax using linked files for apartments, but you will see us use linked files for buildings that then have model groups in the apartments. And so we'll jump into that. Before we actually open Revit, I want to just run through really quick the pros and cons on paper, or what we think the pros and cons are for both groups and links. So if you were going to model a repetitious unit, which may be an apartment, it may be a patient room, or any similar kind of repeating unit, one of the things that's nice about groups is everything is all in one file. You're not dimensioning to things in a linked file. You're not tagging things in a linked file. It's convenient for editing because everything exists all in one file. Now, this also shouldn't be understated, but another important thing is that when you're scheduling, they are actually different objects. So if I have a door that's in a group and I have 5 groups, there are actually 5 different doors and not one door that's scheduling 5 times. Which is what happens when you have linked instances. Doesn't seem like a big deal when we're delivering design work, but when you get into owning the models downstream and wanting to populate them with either construction or asset data, it gets tricky when they are all just copies of the same linked element because they can't have discrete information in them. When you want to annotate model groups, you can do some really neat stuff in terms of attaching detail groups, but also when you're modeling with groups, all the annotation tools are just the native annotating tools. So you're not having to get into the crazy by-linked view workflow or tagging through links and that stuff that we'll talk about a little later. If you have groups for units or patient rooms, it's also really easy to make a unique one or a different one. You can actually just edit type duplicate the way you can with anything else in Revit, which makes model groups really easy to work with in terms of when you get to the 11th hour of the project and things suddenly do have to become slightly different. And again, and this is more for the downstream folks, but for us at Parallax, we have to deliver a lot of projects where the model is getting exported to Navisworks. It is being used for 3D coordination. The owner does want a copy of it. So when you're exporting a model and carrying it on downstream, the fact that everything actually does exist as individual units with groups is a lot more functional for things like 3D coordination. If you have linked files, then again, you can do things like set the links to attachment, and then you can tell the Navisworks exporter to still kick out all the linked files, but it can still be a bit of a hardship for other folks on the team. Okay, now let's jump into all the nasty stuff about groups, right? You're going to notice a bunch of these are in quotes, and we're going to talk about why they're in quotes in a few minutes. So I'm not saying these are facts. I'm saying this is the perception of groups, right? They're unstable. They shouldn't be mirrored. They shouldn't be rotated, and nobody should ever do that bad thing of putting groups inside of groups. We also hear, and we being Parallax, we hear a lot from customers that groups are really bad for performance. They slow down models, they make models huge, they cause corruptions, and that groups do suck with the API. I'll give you a little insight as to what's coming on the next slide. That one's not in quotes because that one really does suck. Groups have a super limited API. There's not a whole lot you can do, which is kind of frustrating. And of course, there's also the issue of the fixed group error, like what happens when groups break and you're in the middle of working, and then you have to either ungroup or break groups. That's annoying, and that one really is a legit concern. But we'll talk about how the frequency that happens has to do with a few simple things a lot of folks don't know about groups. And lastly, there is varying floor-to-floor heights and how you handle that with model groups. And that does really stink to work with. But the reality is that stinks with links as well. So essentially, if you've got units that you want to call the same and they've got differing floor-to-floor heights, there's a certain amount of fudgery or working around it that you're going to be doing anyway. Now, the other thing is, and we'll cover what we may show a demo of this if I really want to break stuff at the end of the presentation, but if you have to reload families or types that are buried inside groups, that can get to be complex. Not in a sense of something simple, like you have a bed and you need to reload the bed, but you know, as an example, the door library that we offer to our clients, oftentimes we send out updates to it. So we've had clients want to update basically, you know, en masse 250 families that are in their models. And if you try to force reload all 250 of them, and there's hundreds of units already in the project, it's probably going to get a little angry. There's workarounds for it, but it's still annoying. And with Revit, there definitely are complications with work sharing in model groups. And this one is legit. A lot of folks don't know this. Revit doesn't check for permissions to edit the group until you hit finish group. So one of the things that you need to be careful of is I tell everybody to use what I call the butt dyno, which is like, don't be inside a group for longer than 20 minutes. If you're in there longer than 20 minutes, hit finish and then synchronize just so that you can, you know, make sure that your work is saved. Because when you're in a group, your work isn't saved until you successfully finish, and it won't check for the work sharing permissions it needs until you hit finish, which is kind of lousy. I sort of wish they had done that differently, but I understand the issues and why they couldn't. And yeah, there is an issue of, we're going to talk about when there are multiple files. So the garden style part of the equation where there are 5 buildings and you've got one unit A1, and how do you propagate it to all of the different buildings to keep the groups the same? And we'll talk through some of that once we get out of the PowerPoint portion. Did I miss one there? Just that, you know, there's a hardware component to this that we'll talk about also. Now, I want to do the same thing for links. And then after we get through this slide, I can actually open up some files and show you a couple of things. So in theory, when we're listing out the pros and cons of links versus groups, let's see, somebody came unmuted. Anyways, okay, so in theory, links should be more lightweight, right? Because the elements aren't really there. They're copies of instances of the same links, so that should make things more lightweight. It is absolutely true. You're not going to get the fixed groups warning, which is amazing. You won't have individual units that kind of break apart. Reloading families in concept is a lot easier because it's not going to break the groups apart. You just have to open up all of the links to reload all the families. And of course, you won't have, and I should not have written no work sharing complications. I should have written less work sharing complications. There still are work sharing complications with links. That has more to do with file open and file reload, but you're not going to have the same level of trepidation that you will with groups in terms of, can I successfully finish editing a group? Making a unique unit when they're links is, I guess I would say, it's not quite as elegant as it is with, you know, edit, type, and duplicate. You just have to open a link and do a save as, which isn't awesome, but it's still not as bad as just having hundreds of individually, you know, freestanding units that you have to edit. Now, one thing that people like to point out as an advantage to link files is that where you put the documentation in either file is a choice that you get to make. I don't really think this is an advantage because when you start getting into the workflows of by linked view or tagging through links and showing wall sections that are done in other files, this is where we start to see a lot of firms actually really kind of muck up their documentation and where drawings start to get really ugly because of issues where the boundaries are with file links. So I'm going to list it as an advantage, but really, I don't think it is. And this last one has to do with something that we did a long time ago on a project, but I wouldn't recommend firms actually try this. And this is when you have linked files, and I'm actually going to pull up just my little live draw thing so we can draw for a minute here. When you have linked files, whoops, I guess I shouldn't have done that. So you've got your main model here, and then let's suppose that you do have a link here, and this is another copy of the same link. So we'll just call it link number 1. What is interesting is inside the link number 1 file, you can then have different design options. And we'll call this, design option A, and B is a terrible drawing. But what's kind of interesting then is when you are inside your main model, you can go to VG-RVT link and select each instance and change their design option, which allows you to show some minor variations in units and things without actually needing to make separate linked files. And I also just want to throw out there, I'd like to talk about this just because it is possible. I did this on a project with an entire project team. I would never, ever, ever do this again. This is a horrible idea. Everybody will hate you by the end of the project. You'll be miserable. Everybody will just, yeah, this is terrible. Let's never talk about it again. Okay, so the negatives of linked files, right? So you have to move back and forth between the files, which is not awesome in concept or in execution. When people are documenting and they're working in linked files, they'll have to go file open into the units and then file open into the main model. One thing I will throw out there is a misconception that you can't be in 2 linked files at the same time. That used to be the case. I want to say that was a long time ago, like 2012, 2013. You've been able to be in 2 linked files for a number of years, though. It's been 7 or 8 years at least. The only caveat there is that you have to be in a local file of each one. So again, if I do my little diagram, if you've got this building here and then you've got the linked file that's within it, you can absolutely be in a local file of this building. And you can also be in a linked file of this unit. And you can do that without it unloading the unit. The reason people think you can't is if you're in the actual building file and you go to the project browser and select this link and tell it to open, it tries to open the central file of the link. But if you actually just use file open and then you go to the central file of the unit and tell it that you want to open a local, it will allow you to open both of these and you can have them open side by side. And then you just need to remember that when you synchronize with central on this one, somebody will want to reload it in that one because that doesn't happen automatically. All that said, it still stinks. Being in 2 files and having to move back and forth between them to do your annotating is absolutely abysmal. And then you also get into this complex situation of how are you going to do your actual drawings? And it's not a simple question. There's a whole lot of stuff to unpack here in terms of, are your plans to tag in the main model and tag objects in the linked file, which is what we call tagging through a link? Or is your plan to go into the linked unit and do your annotations there and then use by linked view in the main model? So those are kind of 2 completely different options that you have, and they both have some pros and cons. One of them being edit cut profile doesn't work. So I'm not sure how many of you use edit cut profile a lot. We use it all the time. Instead of using like filled regions and masking regions, you can use edit cut profile to, modify layers of things like wall sections and plan details mildly to get them, a little more augmented than how they look live from the model. Well, you can't cut profile if you're in a view that is touching linked objects. So if you want to do cut profile, your only option is to go through the linked file, which then means that now you're having to go into the linked file if you want to do your annotations, and then you have to set your main model to by linked view. That has a whole lot of downsides. Let me see, is that the next thing that comes in? No. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of downsides to having this model here and then having this down here, and then this is set to linked view. One of the downsides is folks often forget that links don't reload automatically. So there is what we call the link loading disparity, which is, let's say that Aaron is on a job with Bob because it's the letter B. And I open the model at 8 in the morning. Okay. Now I've got the main model opened from 8 in the morning, and I've also got the linked model open from 8 in the morning, or at least the linked model is linked in as of 8 in the morning. Now, Bob comes in, and at 9 in the morning, Bob goes straight into the unit and creates a whole bunch of new stuff. And then at 10, Bob then goes back into the main model. Now, here's what's interesting. At 10 o'clock, I am still in this linked model, but I am still looking at a version of the link that's from 8 o'clock in the morning. And Bob is now looking at a version that's from 10, which includes the changes that he made between 9 and 10. So while this sounds like a minor technicality, and to be fair, I haven't actually reviewed this in the last 5 or 6 years, but this used to cause all sorts of issues with the bi-linked view settings and annotations. But even if it no longer causes issues with bi-linked view, what it definitely does is creates a problem where Bob dimensions to something in that version of the file that I don't have in my version of the file. So now there is kind of a conflict of his version of the model is convinced an object is there that there's a dimension going to. My version of the model has a stale link that does not even know that object is there. And this is where you get into things like dimensions disappearing and people getting mad, like who deleted my stuff? And it makes working in links exhausting. Now, we're going to come back to that in a little bit. Okay. So there's also the question of overlay versus attachment for your links and what happens to your consultants and what happens to people downstream. This gets to be a brutal conversation because as we start to look at some big projects, if you've got a multifamily building with hundreds of units and they're set to overlay, that's the more lightweight, proper way of linking them in. But then when your consultants link in your main model, they don't see any of your units. So now all of your units have to be linked in as attachments. And for reasons unknown, which we'll look at in a few minutes, the performance in that situation, actually the performance even with overlay is going to tank. But when things are set to attachment, everything is going to get a lot more miserable in terms of speed. Now, what's also worse is at some point when you're working with links, you have to decide where do the room objects go and where do the area objects go. And areas, so areas and rooms get to be a little interesting, right? So hopefully you're all aware of the warning dialog. It's on the manage ribbon. Apologize if you hear toddlers screaming in the background, by the way. So the manage review warnings command allows you to go through all the warnings in your project. Room and area warnings, by the way, do something particularly interesting. And I don't have, it's very hard to get a metric on concrete data for this, but just to show you a sample, if you have main models and then you have series of linked models in them, and the links are all set to by room bounding, and you do something like unload the links. So we're going to unload them. And when we unload them, we're instantly going to see 800 warnings about rooms being unbound. Right? On the surface, we're not really worried about these 800 warnings at the moment because we know they're going to instantly fix themselves when we just hit reload on the link, right? All 800 rooms will be bound again. Life is good. There does appear to be some evidence, though, that for whatever reason, once these 800 warnings have happened and it's a room geometry warning, which we know does actually affect file performance, even when these things get fixed, that file performance degradation doesn't seem to go away until you completely exit Revit and go back in. So unlike other warnings, right? Like if you copy a curtain wall that's got 10,000 mullions and you paste it on top of each other, so you have 10,000 identical instances in the same place. We know if you simply delete one of the curtain walls, the performance goes back to normal right away. For whatever reason, with room and area warnings, that doesn't seem to happen. The warnings do go away, but the performance seems to stay gimped until we completely exit Revit and go back in. So I'm not entirely sure if that's related to rooms and areas or if it's related to links. Either way, it's a huge bummer. Lastly, before we jump into some actual files, one of the other things that's brutal about working in links is updating content. So the question is, who's doing it and how are they doing it? I need to update a door from the library. So now somebody is responsible for opening every linked file and making sure the door is up to date. By the way, there's an app called Guardian out there. I'm not sure if any of you guys have seen it. Guardian's amazing for helping with this sort of thing. But I'm not actually sure that even Guardian does that automatically amongst linked files. So it's just something to keep in mind. Updating content can be a bit of a chore. And the other thing that we just want to list as a con is going back to this design option disaster that we tried many years ago. Something to keep in mind is that a linked model does not get a project-wide setting, which means when you have unit A1 on the first floor, that's a linked file, your view settings for that linked model still have to be handled view by view by view in your main model. Sure, you have view templates, but you can't set project-wide in a model things like VG, RBT link design options. You do have to handle it view template by view template, which can be brutal. So now we've covered on paper what's supposed to be good and bad about both of these ideas, right? Yeah, floor to floor heights, I forgot about that one. They still suck on links too, but they suck with groups, so it doesn't matter. Now, this is one of the things that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to show you this live on the fly, is there is a massive disparity in performance that we don't account for on paper because we don't even know why it's there. So before we do that, I'm going to eliminate the pros, and I want to just talk only about the cons because I want to talk about which ones are actually real and which ones are not. And these are the things we're going to actually look at Revit for. So one of the first things we talked about is groups shouldn't be mirrored, they shouldn't be rotated, and putting groups inside of groups is a horrible thing. And this is where we're going to actually jump in to some fun Revit stuff. So here is hopefully all of your favorite Revit files ever. This is the illustrious basic sample house from like 1990 something. I don't know, whenever they built this. What we're going to do here is we're going to just, oh, and by the way, we're in Revit 2014 right now. And that's because this is kind of neat, but we taught a class on these very issues with model groups at a build conference in Australia back in 2014. And what's interesting that even we didn't really know until recently is sometime after, and I'm not saying it was because of that presentation, but sometime in the next couple of years that followed, a lot of the group issues were quietly fixed. Now, all that to say, even back in 2014, we had methods to make the groups work properly, and we're going to talk about those today. But it is interesting that in order to show you some of these glitches or some of these problems, we have to show you back in 14 because the development and the QA team quietly fixed a lot of it, even though we didn't know. So I'm going to just make a little group down here in the corner. I'll throw a couple chairs so that we can see. Okay, my OCD is going to freak out because when I was practicing this before, I was doing the opposite like this, and I just can't. It's not going to go well for me if we don't do the same thing. Okay, so here we have a little group, and I'm going to select all this stuff. It's just 4 walls and a couple of chairs. I'm going to group it. And if we really quickly look at all the things people told us never to do with groups, such as we're going to rotate the group, it's going to work fine. We're going to mirror the group, it's going to work fine. We're going to mirror the group at a funky angle, it's still going to work fine. Okay, but there is, it is very much true that there were things that could happen to groups that would suddenly make those things not fine. So if we were to grab a cabinet and place it on the wall, boop, like this, and we'll do, well, we'll just do one for now. So if we do that, and then we were to copy the group again, and then we were to rotate it, you'd see that it's still working okay, and then we could mirror it again, and you'll see that it's still working okay. So it took us a lot of trial and error to figure out exactly what the problem was, but it is absolutely true that back in 2014, you could get into situations where the moment you went to mirror a group, things would freak out like this. Now, in this case, it worked, but it ruined a cabinet. But the only reason it worked was because I had not copied the group. And obviously, if you try to copy it, now you get this disaster right here. And this is a lot of what started the reputation of groups simply can't be mirrored. Okay. Now, if we were to undo that and we were to just drag a copy of the group and try to rotate it the same way, you'd also get the same exact kind of problem. So for years, we've been reading and hearing all kinds of stuff about how you simply can't do all these things that we talked about. Where's that PowerPoint? Which is we shouldn't mirror, we shouldn't rotate, and putting groups in groups is bad. I'm giving away the whole slide here, but we'll come back and talk about it in a couple of minutes. Now, what made me go down the rabbit hole of wanting to find out what this problem was is at my last firm, before I started Parallax, we worked on 2 different types of projects that used repetitious groups. We did multifamily with apartments, and we did hospitals with patient rooms. Now, one of the big differences in hospitals, patient rooms, and multifamily apartments is the number of items that are getting placed on the wall was vastly different. So if you consider a patient room that has a medical head wall, there's really only one head wall placed on the wall. But if you think about an apartment with cabinets, many cabinets get placed on the wall. And so the trouble is, I was comparing patient room, which only had one head wall on the wall, to the apartment, which had multiples. And of course, this is where you'll see that this group is now behaving exactly how we want it to, whereas this one is completely having all kinds of issues. By the way, a small interesting bit of information about this is these things that failed were also failing because of some erratic math function. If you were to rotate this group by 88 degrees and then ask it to rotate it by the last 2 degrees, it would absolutely work and it would absolutely be stable. There was something about the values of 90 and 180 and 270 that made these kind of things fail. So for a little while, it was simply a matter of us telling people always go by 88 degrees and then do it 2 more degrees. Why? And I don't know why, go have a drink after because it's annoying. But that's kind of what we had to do. And then we started looking into, well, what is the difference between these two groups and what is causing this functional difference? And what we come to find out is the difference really had to do with the fact that the casework was modeled as face-based families. Now, that's on me, by the way, because this is an old library that I built of millwork. And what we discovered is there seemed to be a glitch in Revit at the time, or a glitch in the matrix, if you will, and it had to do with the number of face-based objects and the number of faces they were hosted to. And we found this out because, again, we were troubleshooting the difference between our hotels, our apartments and our hospitals, and we were like, that can't really be the case, right? But sure enough, if you were, that is the wrong command because this is not really my computer, if you were to split the wall, so that there now are 2 discrete walls, and you were to use pick new host such that now this cabinet is hosted to this wall and this cabinet is hosted to this wall, all of your group issues will have gone away. In terms of now, you could copy this group and you could rotate it the full 90 and you could mirror it and it wouldn't break. So the takeaway from this, by the way, this is not a sustainable answer, right? This was part of troubleshooting. This was not so we could recommend this workflow to people, because if you can imagine, if you had 15 outlets on a wall, you can't break the wall into 15 pieces. The purpose of this exercise was just for us to ascertain what was the problem with model groups that was contributing to this reputation of can't rotate, can't mirror. And it turns out the whole time it was face-based or work plane-based families that were hosted to the face of the wall, and there was more than one object per hosting face. So what was our takeaway from that? Really, it was just start switching everything to unhosted families. Get rid of the face-based outlets, get rid of the face-based cabinets, and start converting all of our millwork and things of that nature into completely unhosted families. And I happen to have the cut plane here cut so far that you can't see any upper cabinets. There's an upper cabinet. So if you were, you'd have to take my word for it, but this upper cabinet family in our new Parallax library is completely unhosted. All of our clients, and by the way, 2 of our clients have been gracious enough to actually let us open their projects so that we can show them in this demo. That's Niles Bolton Architecture out of Atlanta, and Michael Graves up in New Jersey. So this is basically a 30-story building or somewhere close. I'm sorry, this one is 9. The other one that I've opened is 30. And you'll see that here, all of the units have been done as model groups. A bunch of them are mirrored. A bunch of them are rotated. They don't exhibit any of that bizarre, anti-group, fixed group issues and all that kind of stuff. The whole Achilles heel of these behaviors in model groups has been having hosted or face-based families. Unfortunately, that also includes line-based families. So we did have to go through our entire library offering and basically say, you know what, line-based families are great for a bunch of things, but we're never going to make line-based families again. Face-based is handy. We'll use face-based families where they need to actually cut holes out of things, if they need to go like on the outside of the building, but then those things don't want to go in groups per se. But our base libraries have all now converted to unhosted. Now we're going to jump back to PowerPoint. We'll come back to some models in a minute to talk about more stuff. So one of the other things that we hear a lot of, right, is that groups slow down models. They make models huge. They cause corruptions and they suck with the API. Now, a couple of these things that I've put in orange here are true. So it is true that when you have tons of model groups of things like apartments, they're going to make your models huge. And it's also true, and I have tons of sympathy for anybody on the call who does programming or works with the Revit API. Groups basically like have a super limited Revit API or API in Revit. That is true. But there's often a false correlation rate here in terms of, do my models get huge? Yes. Do my models perform poorly? Yes. Well, then these two things must be related. And that's unfortunately just completely not true. We make a logical leap there. And so one of the things I wanted to show you is that right now we have oops, I need to close my got the wrong thing open here. So we have a ridiculous amount of models open right now so that we can look at them in this lecture. So this one is a 9-story tall block style full U. I haven't counted exactly how many units there are in the building, but I could. We have another one open that is much taller. No, I'm sorry, this one is, okay, it's a little taller. It's 15 stories. And again, all the units fully populated. This one has all the furniture in as well. Much more dense style building. You'll see here, and actually here I've even got shadows turned on like a jerk, which I didn't realize I had. But you'll see here that the performance is pretty manageable for being 15 stories. I've got an older one that I opened just to kind of demonstrate this. And so this one is 26 stories. Now this one is 2 files, but that just has to do with the fact that there was a core and shell architect and there was the fit out as well. But you'll see here again, all the units in one file, all plopped in as model groups, performance pretty manageable. And again, I've got a bunch of graphic effects turned on. So you'll see that it's, when it takes a couple seconds to regenerate. Here's what I wanted to show you. Because I agree with most of you, if you are one of the folks who's thinking that on paper, links should completely be better than groups. I thought that as well, which is what kind of sent me down these roads eventually to do some of these studies. So what we did before today's demo is we took a much smaller project. Now, oh great, my sync with central timer is going to make me do my sync. Now, this project is not just one building. It's 4 buildings that are next to each other, but you'll see here that they are much smaller buildings and they're all only 3 stories tall. But I want you to watch when I go to kick off the 3D view, which already exists in this file, by the way. So it's not generating the 3D view for the first time. The disparity in the amount of time that it takes right here to actually show this model. So not the time to actually, move to the 3D dash parallax Aaron M view, but the time to actually present the model to everybody. This disparity here has to do with the fact that the units were all converted to links. So I was wrong. It's 6 tiny little buildings. But you'll notice here that again, anytime we orbit now, the regeneration time is abysmally slow by comparison. And these buildings are tiny, so it's not even a one-to-one comparison. We don't have the exact math on this. We could actually take the RFO benchmark and kind of manipulate it to show the differences in the performance. But there is this interesting, what appears to be some sort of a linear relationship between the count of the links that exist in the project and the performance degradation or slowdown that happens. So if we were to go look at this, by the way, if we were to jump into VG and go to RVT links, of course, you'll see here that in this particular sample, we've got all the units that are done as the linked files. So what we may do one day, because it would be kind of an interesting exercise, unfortunately, it's hard to just invest the time in it, it would be fun to run some timed exercises in terms of view regeneration and whatnot, and compare how many numbers of unit links there need to be before the performance starts to tank. But it is noticeable, and that's where a lot of frustration starts to come in for the users who are trying to manipulate these things and they're just watching the spin wheel all day. It doesn't look like it's a very large amount of time, but even just that few seconds every single time you want to regenerate or move the file is a bit much to take. So let's see, we'll let that kind of regenerate itself over there, and we'll jump back to, let's see here. We'll go back to this one just because this one's pretty easy to look at. And then we'll jump back over here. Okay, so we're going to go back to this briefly. So we have found, though, that we can mirror, we can rotate, and groups going in groups is an interesting debate. So I have a suspicion that a lot of what people think is bad about groups and groups stems from the fact that their groups may have been plagued by the earlier problems that were causing issues with things like rotation or things like mirroring. Because I can tell you that, Niles Bolton, one of our clients who's basically created this building here, they are strong proponents of groups and groups as we are. And they've even done some interesting things where if you were to go basically into a bathroom, there will be a group for the unit itself. And then there may also be, I would probably struggle to find one at the moment if I go look, but there will be basically bathroom groups inside the unit groups, kitchen groups inside the unit groups. And similarly, if we were to jump back to here, I can tell you, I'm just looking for some dead space to draw a picture. Back when we were doing patient rooms, which we still do out of model groups, we will actually, and patient rooms are probably the most aggressive in terms of doing this, but what we will actually do is have the entire patient room as a group, and then the head wall is a group inside, the side wall is a group inside, the other side wall is a group inside, and the foot wall is a group inside. And then sometimes we will also have the furniture as its own group in the middle, and then we will group all of these. So why do we do that, by the way? Because the same problem exists for apartments that exists for patient rooms, which is that usually when we say they're all the exact same, what we mean is they're pretty darn close, but they may have a variance of like a 1/2 inch to 1 inch, side to side. The demise walls might be in slightly different locations. So if they all are exactly the same, then having them as one discrete unit group makes a whole lot of sense. But if they're going to vary a couple of inches here and there, or a couple of fractions of inches here or there, having the side walls and the head walls as their own subgroups means you still don't have to edit the 15 different size variations all separately. It's actually been pretty cool because we're working on a hospital right now where we're actually modeling all of the head walls for prefabrication for the contractor and the subcontractors. And again, there's 15 different rooms that are all supposed to be exam rooms, but they're all slightly different sizes. So having the groups in the groups is helping us in that situation. And actually our head walls are even groups in a group in a group. They're 2 levels down. The subcomponents for the head walls are. So if we jump back in, let's see where we ended up here. So we talked about the bad performance. Okay, so the fixed group thing, that is a real situation that needs to be dealt with. And so the trick is that we're hoping once you've started mitigating the issues up here, this will still happen, but it happens less. And if it happens less, then it's just a matter of educating the users on how to deal with it. Okay, so the moment fixed groups comes up, we need to work through it. The way to work through it is always to select make new groups and never select ungroup. And once you've done make new groups, you need to go to the project browser, look and see why are there new groups, what's different about them, switch one of them to the other one, and then get rid of the erroneous group. It's miserable, but it's still certainly better than letting somebody hit ungroup or not teaching them how to work around the issue. And again, we're going to kind of ignore the varying floor-to-floor heights because there's nothing that we can really do about that. And reloading the families and types definitely is difficult. So here is kind of where, when somebody asks us links versus groups, right? Because if you're looking at this list here, it still doesn't sound amazing. But here's what's interesting about it is we have the green issues, which we can totally solve. We have the orange issues, which are real, but there are techniques to working around it. Now, if we start going through the same list for the links, so moving back and forth between the files, it's annoying, but we can do it, no issues there. The big ticket items, such as where do we annotate and how do we deal with working with the multiple files and the annotations, there isn't actually a good solution to that. And one of the things I like to bring up is what we call this round robin issue, which is what are we dimensioning to? So earlier in the discussion, we said, let's talk about links and whether or not we wanted to tag or keynote the linked objects using, functionality that came in 2012 and newer, which allows you to like put a wall tag on a linked wall. If you haven't been using Revit that long, you used to not be able to do that, by the way. Or do you want to put all your annotations in the linked file, and then in your main model, you set the view to VG, RVT link by linked view. Here is the issue with that. By linked view, doesn't solve all of your issues. And the example I want to give is, here is a building, and we're going to use the same example of here is our apartment. Now we're also going to show here is a grid line. You like my awesome drawings? If you want to use by linked view, it means you are in the blue file and you want to put all the dimensions in plan. Guess what's not in the blue file? The grid. So what happens when you want to place this dimension that goes to the grid line? Oh, hold on, there's a solution for that. I can use copy monitor to pull in my grid into that particular file. There's a few problems with that. That unit exists in a whole bunch of spots in the building, and they don't all have that grid there. So what you get into now is, by the way, let's even suppose that you did this. Well, here's what's interesting. It's important to note that these two grids are not the same. You have a grid here that is in the linked model, and you have a grid here that's in the main model. So let's say you were to do this. You copy monitor the grid and you place the dimension on it. Well, when you pull in the linked files, this grid is not the one that shows up. Chances are you've gone into VG RVT link and you've turned off grids because the main model already has its own grid. That means this dimension goes away because the dimension will not automatically rehost itself from a linked grid to the main grid. So, okay, damage control, here's the reality. All of our dimensions are going to be in the blue file for things that are within the unit, but then we're also going to just have to have a couple of dimensions that go from the grid to the edge of the unit, like so. And this is just one particular example, right? But the issue is the round robin issue of objects that exist in the main model, but that you want a dimension to in the linked unit. This presents an interesting problem. And by the way, as recently as 2021, we discovered a very bizarre glitch, and we don't work with linked units like this, but we just happened to discover this on behalf of a client that wanted us to ask about it. It does appear, by the way, that there is a random issue where radial and diameter dimensions that are touching linked objects will drop off when the linked file is reloaded. Rectangular dimensions, however, will not. And it's just a matter of there's something about the radial and the diameter dimensions that just make them freak out. So interestingly enough, if you want to dimension a round column in your consultant structural model and you don't want the dimension to keep disappearing, if you actually tab select when you dimension so that you get the invisible references of their reference planes instead of actually using the diameter or the radius, that dimension will suddenly not delete itself next time you reload the link. Crazy random issue. Just thought we'd bring it up. Okay, so zipping through this. Again, you still have this issue of overlay versus attachment and what exists for your consultants. And that's a big deal because your consultants may not be seeing the whole building, but it's solvable. You set it all to attachment. Everybody hates you, but it's not the end of the world. So the rooms and the areas and the bounding warnings, there really aren't fixes for that either. So you can kind of get around it. You can work through it by simply not unloading the links and then not having to deal with the performance disparity once that started to happen. But again, the reality is solvable. So we're going to just call that one an orange. But the content updating is another one that there really isn't a good way to solve. So when you have a main model and then you have all these linked units, how do you update things like, you know, doors or furniture or millwork families? And with something like millwork, that gets to be really interesting because what a lot of people forget is if I were to come in and I were to, let's say, load some cabinets, you need to deal, oops, that's not the right one. That's probably not the right one either. You need to deal with the fact that all of these types could potentially have different parameters in both the links and in the main model. And again, that's where something like Guardian can really help with managing that. But even with Guardian, so the real question is, let's suppose that somebody on my team has loaded in 36 by 34.5 by 24A into the main model, but then somebody else has loaded it into the unit and then they've changed the door style or the drawer style on those cabinets in one of the two files. So now, even if you were to run a schedule of those two things, they're going to list as being the same type, but they very well may not be the same type. And that's why the issues that you have to deal with, oh, and now Windows has freaked out. That's a bummer. The issues that you have to deal with when you're working in links are kind of not as solvable. But let's suppose they were, okay? Let's suppose you had a way to deal with this that we're not too worried about. This is still a big issue, but we'll leave that there. The interesting one is we also don't really have any way to deal with the fact that for whatever reason, the linked units, even though on paper they should be more efficient, they just cause this massive regeneration disparity. What I am happy to say, by the way, and this would only be, I'd only be able to show you this if we actually had the linked project back in 2014. They have in recent years at least made it better to where it used to be, oh, I can't, okay, I have to synchronize before I can get to my other ribbon, sorry. It used to be that another big disparity in the performance happened when you tried to drag a section mark or an elevation mark. And the moment you started dragging this view command, you would start getting the spin wheel, and you had to wait for the spin wheel to stop before you could click the second dot. And if you didn't wait, it didn't do anything. But if you moved the cursor again, it just kept spinning. The nice thing is they do seem to have fixed that in recent years. So now if we go to drag the section mark, you'll see that it's almost instantaneous and you're just waiting for the regeneration after the view is created. If we were to do this exercise where we created or converted one of the projects back to links, it would be interesting to go back and do that in 2014 and see if the old performance disparity still exists there. Unfortunately, I'm running 2014 in viewer mode because we don't have any 14 licenses anymore. So if anybody has 14 licenses, we could potentially get together and just see what that looks like. But we know the disparity existed at least back in like 2012, 2013. So it's kind of a non-starter, really. So all that to say, there are just a couple more things I'll run through. So obviously by now you can see that what we do is we use the model groups as what we'll call our smallest repetitive unit, which is the apartment itself. There were the combination or hard cases that we talked about. So what do we do when it's one drawing set, but there are multiple buildings, or it's multiple buildings, you know, that are in just a grid divided drawing set, which is still all one drawing set? This is where we will kind of combine the two methods. So we'll still do the apartments as individual groups, but then we will do typical buildings as linked files. So you'll see here, if this is building type A and this is building type A and they're the same, we will do building type A as a file. And then what's nice about that is you'll actually go in building type A and do the plans for building type A. That means that you're still just interacting with unit groups and you're doing all your dimensions within the entire building. But then if you need to have an overall plan of this campus and you want to show the dimensions on it, you can set building A to bi-linked view floor plan. The difference there is your number of bi-linked view settings, you've got 5 to 6 because there's 5 to 6 buildings. You don't have 50 or 60. And there's something else that's interesting that you can do. And I'm just going to draw this out in space because it's kind of interesting. You know, one of the questions always becomes, well, we want all these plans to be orthogonal in our documentation, but we might want to build a site model. So one of the things I tell folks is I don't believe in documentation models. I always pick the largest building, and that becomes the one that has all my sheets in it, because having one extra model where everybody is always in a linked model because they're working in a sheet model is kind of annoying. So if I have 3 building types, but maybe there's 6 or 7 buildings on site, what I'll do is I'll pick the biggest building and we'll call this building 1. And that becomes my documentation model. That's where all of my sheets live for all of my buildings. Now, what's interesting is you can also have a site model that looks like this. And what I'll do is I will actually link in building 2 and building 3 into building 1 just to do my bi-linked view documentation that goes on my sheets. But when I link them in, I'll keep them perfectly orthogonal and just drop them in my drawing set. That way, I'm not having to rotate the scope boxes and reorient my plans and rotate all my callouts. But then when I link all of them into my site model, that, of course, is where I'll actually orient them the correct way. And so now what's happening is the only sheet that's really in this site model is the site plan. And this sheet can have all the buildings oriented properly. You can do published coordinates from here. And again, if you're, so we always use shared coordinates and set them up properly. But so if you want to, you can actually publish multiple named spaces to each model. That way, both coordinate sets exist in there. You can do the same thing for your other files. What you end up with is you've got individual building files that are all straight on the sheet for your drawings. You've got a site plan model that still has all of the buildings in the proper context. But then when you go into each building, you're also still just working with the units as model groups, which means you get all the benefits of working with grouped files. Let's see. Oh, this is just what we talked about. So the linked document, or the largest building, becomes the documentation file, and so on. Does anybody have any questions? I do see one comment in the chat that I'll address in just a second. There was one other thing that I'll show you guys if everybody has a couple of extra minutes, and if you want to type in some comments, you can. When we last talked about links versus groups, one thing that people asked about was how to move the documentation around with the groups themselves. And so what I'm going to do, let me see, what are we in 21 here? I'm going to just start a blank project real quick. I should have had a blank file ready to go. I didn't think about it. We'll go in there. That's fine. So one of the things that a lot of folks seem to forget is that model groups can also carry attached detail groups. And we use this religiously. We use it in our apartments, our patient rooms, our head walls, and everything. And so what I'm going to do is, you'll remember that on the insert ribbon, once you have a model group that you've created, you can save it out using either file export library, or you can go down to the project browser and go to groups and save out a model group. We have to wait for my silly Keynote file to load here. I should have turned that off. So while we're waiting for that, what we're going to look at is, if I were to go to my Revit share to 2021, and we were to go to model groups, we save a repository in our office. So we have healthcare rooms, we have apartments, we have entire movie theater rooms, and we have things like restrooms. And they are not just model groups that have the geometry in them. They can be fully annotated with as many views as you want to have saved in those objects. So if this thing ever finishes, if it doesn't, we'll just go use another file. Should be done any minute. Everything else I have open that don't really want to do it in. Here we go. Okay, so let me answer these couple of questions that are coming in while we're waiting for Revit. So Jason says, I'd love to know what the threshold would be. Oh, that's for the performance degradation and links. I would say anything over 50 to 60 links. So here's what's interesting about that, Jason. We do see a performance degradation even when architecture breaks their file up into 2 links. So when they even do core and shell versus interior, there is a noticeable slight performance degradation. What we have to investigate is how linear is that progression. So it's certainly not exponential. Like if it was exponential and we had 60 units, the entire file would just be crippled. So the fact that we can have 60 unit links and the file still functions, it's probably like a linear regeneration amount. But yeah, it would be interesting to see. And Jason asked a question on the linked models before placing in the site model. Would you use the Project North versus True North option in each model or not set that at all? Yeah, so good point. We absolutely would set up True North, but it's important to remember that True North is a setting that is part of the named places or the shared coordinates, right? So the reason that's important is in that little demo project that we sketched out, there was like building type A. But then when we were in the site model, building type A existed at 2 different orientations. So what you would want to do is you would want to have named place 1 and named place 2. And I always personally use specify coordinate at a point and rotate true north. I don't ever use the publish acquire method, but you could. But inside this building file, there's going to be 2 named places, and each one is going to have a separate true north. If we had more time today, I would actually run through it. But what that will basically do is it means that when you come in this location dialog, you will have, most people leave it set to what's called, it just has the name is just internal. But what you'll actually have in here in the building file is building location 1 and building location 2. And whichever one that you use as make current, it will then rotate the true north between those 2 because each one has its own true north. So I'm going to come back, Eric, to your question in just 1 second. Let me start this process really quick, because what I want to just do is do load as group on the insert ribbon, which is just what allows us to load in a model group. And then I'm going to go to my model group directory here, and I'll just pull in a restroom as an example. It's the one I typically use for this. You'll notice here that there's an attached detail group option. So while that's coming in, Eric asked, do we ever exclude items from the model group, such as demising walls in the units? So interesting question. I would never recommend using exclude groups as in the Revit command, right? So they released that. I want to say that was version 9.1 or 9 back in 2007. You can now like tab select an item in a model group and hit delete. It does what's called excluding the object. I would never ever do it. It starts to make things behave erratically, and their performance does get a little ugly as well. Having said that, yes, demise walls don't ever go in the groups for us. So we always recommend, if you were to go, let me jump back. I know I'm jumping all over the place now. If you were to go here and select a model group, you'll see here that the demise walls are not part of either of these groups. And that's pivotal, because you don't want to have demise walls overlapping. So demise walls, corridor walls, entry doors, and exterior walls, none of that is actually part of the model groups for us. I actually go one step further, and I sometimes start model grouping portions of the facade where I want like repetitive units to have the same kind of alignment with the fenestration and whatnot. But really, you want the units to just be their own standalone thing. And what's also interesting about that is where we document the units is then in a standalone area as well, where we just draw in generic demise walls to say, refer to actual plans here. But what's also nice about using that, we call it the unit cloud, is that all of our unit drawings are on sheets the moment we start a file. So you'll see here that this is basically what we call the unit cloud, and all the units get placed here, and none of these sheets have to be created. So our template starts out with 53 unit spaces, and there are sheets for all these units. There's multiple sheets, multiple plan view types, all that kind of stuff. So let me jump back real quick to that other demo I was going to do. So here I just pulled in a bathroom, and this is just a quick example to show you that when you make your model groups with attached detail groups, then what happens is you can go to a call out that's called, I don't have a call out in this because I went to a stupid file. That's okay. So we'll make a call out here, and we'll go in there, and we'll say this is a 1/4 inch view. So what's neat is you can be saving these things out to your library where they bring in all of their dimensions and all of their tags on your behalf. And this is not just true for bathrooms, and this is very simple to set up. Essentially, when you're making the model group to harvest it out of your project, you just also select tags, dimensions, lines, text, things of that nature, and you can save an entire library of these things and not be having to remodel them and re-annotate them on every project going forward. Hopefully that makes sense. I had to do that pretty quick. And Kevin did ask, does that affect wall-hosted families? Yeah, absolutely. So you don't want to have them as wall-hosted families. And going one step further, you definitely don't want any wall-hosted families that are then, what model are we in? Oh, this is it. You don't want to have wall-hosted families on the demise walls, period. Because again, the demise wall is not going in the group. I do know some firms like to actually break the demise wall into 2 pieces. I can't stand that solution because they end up with gaps in between them and they don't end up correctly. So basically what I recommend is I recommend not having things wall hosted unless they absolutely need to be. Like our door library is still wall hosted, of course, because the doors need to be aware of the thickness of the wall. But that's basically the only situation where you want something to be wall hosted. So we have another couple of questions coming in. Let me jump into them real quick. So, so Eric says our interior team likes to model baseboards and chair rails as wall sweeps. It works much better with model groups. So there's a few interesting ways to handle that as well. I'll throw a couple of other kind of nuggets at you guys that may seem a little outlandish for a lot of you, but chair rails and baseboards come up a lot. And one of the things I actually recommend is, so hopefully all of you model your finished floors. If I jump to this other model, and I do know we've run over, so if any of you have to go, you can certainly go, and you can catch this in the recording. But hopefully all of you model your finished floors. Let me just tab select this here. One thing I want you to notice is in this particular file, what's modeled as a finished floor is actually a Revit roof. This has a lot of upsides, and baseboards is one of them. So just something to consider. Here's a level and section. And when you make a concrete slab or a structural floor, it starts at the level and it works its way down. This means if you use a floor for your finishes, you have to manually set their offset. So if it's carpet, you have to set it at 5/8 of an inch. If it's tile, you have to set it at 3/8 of an inch. If you use roofs, you leave them all at 0 because they build their thickness up. So a roof that's at 0 will always show the thickness of the finish correctly. And what's also interesting about that is they can then also host roof fascias, which work really well for things like baseboards. And then you're not beholden to having walls in your units for the baseboards. Similarly, crown moldings, and this gets into another whole story, we actually recommend using roofs for a lot of ceilings for the same reason. Our entire house has crown like in almost every room. And if I had to finish a model of this house tomorrow, I would just use roofs for all the ceilings. I'm going to jump to a couple of these other questions. So Beth said, how do you handle lighting in units if they're not face-based? So Beth, that's a really good question. Here's where things get interesting. Until a couple of years ago, my answer would have been unhosted families, simply because you have an interesting situation with lighting anyway. So the fact that they're face-based is helping you put them at the right elevation. But if the ceiling isn't in your file anyway, like if you're MEP and the ceiling's not in your file, then you're not cutting a hole out anyway. So them being face-based is getting you the convenience of setting them at the right elevation, but still not cutting the hole. Unhosted can cut the hole if you use cuts with voids. It is one extra step. If you're using unhosted families for lighting, then of course you want to use some other method to set them to the correct height. And that may just be an RCP that has filters on ceilings by height, or it may be something like Dynamo. But in the past, up until recently, we were pushing people towards more unhosted for light fixtures. Having said that, Melissa in our office actually realized the whole reason we went back to Revit 14 to look at those group issues. Melissa realized that some of the wonky behaviors of face-based families have been fixed in recent years. And we discovered that because we were expecting a group to break because it had some light fixtures in it and they weren't breaking. So interestingly enough, I would cautiously say lighting, you could probably get away with keeping as face-based because they seem to have fixed it in the last few years. Still doesn't make me comfortable. I'll still do ours as unhosted families. But yeah, it definitely warrants a follow-up. So Eric asks, does using model groups impact MEP teams and how they model their items? Awesome question. Here's the reality. The way we really have to ask that question is, which is going to impact MEP worse? Using model groups or using links? Because the reality is, from all the MEP engineers that I've talked to, they're both like a huge kick in the shins to the MEP engineers. Having one giant full building for them, at least in my experience, seems to work better because they're not going to put all of their objects inside the groups or the links, at least again, with the MEP engineers that we work with. What's nice about that is when you have groups, they do have one fully populated building that they can link in and use. When you use links, they sort of get that if it's set to attachment, but then again, their file open time, their file load time is crippled because it's got to load all the instances of those links before they're going to be able to go to work. So that's a good question. As with any consulting engineer, I would say check with them and see what their preference is. Very rarely do I see MEP engineers willing to mess around with either one of these situations. So it's sort of a toss up at that point. Let's see, did I miss anybody's questions? Okay, so Jason was just kind of addressing the MEP question, which is cool. So yeah, I definitely went over on the time. I apologize for that. I'm sure a lot of you were on your lunch break. If you have more questions about this stuff, it's a topic I'm hugely passionate about just because I really do wish doing design work wasn't so complicated in software, and multifamily and healthcare both have a lot of complexities given the mid-size repetitive unit. Fun fact, by the way, if none of you were using Revit back then, a lot of folks don't remember that groups used to actually be their own file extension. There used to be RVT for projects. RTE for templates, RFA for families, and RVGs for groups. That disappeared one day and groups just became RVTs, just like Revit projects, which was kind of interesting. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming. And like I said, feel free to reach out if you have more questions, or if you just want to see any of this slowed down a little bit as a follow-up.
Aaron, thank you on behalf of everybody that attended. Some fantastic information. I suggested you get some help for your sketch on the design options and link models. There's a lot of anger in that sketch. So
there really is, definitely.
Yeah.
We can do that again just for fun.
Definitely appreciate your willingness to share your vast knowledge in such a clear and insightful way. So take care, man. Appreciate it.
Very welcome.
To you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good week. Talk to you later.